Good morning, everybody. We are in a series called The Deeply Formed Life, learning how to live our lives in a way that we become rooted, deeply rooted in the ways of Jesus. And there are 5 practices that we're looking at. The first one is the practice of silence and listening to God. And the biggest part of prayer is actually learning, as my seminary professor said, learning how to shut up long enough for God to get a word in edgewise. And that takes work and practice. The second practice was a surprise, listening to each other, especially listening to each other across um, all of the isms, the barriers of sexism, ageism, racism, especially, learning how to listen, put ourselves in the shoes of another. And then when we see that there's an injustice or an unlevel playing field, to see how God might want us to participate in leveling that playing field. The third spiritual discipline was listening to ourselves, looking in the mirror, taking stock of where I am and being really honest, being able to confess uh, our shortcomings, our sins to God, and being able to say, Lord, lead me in the way that is everlasting. And then to follow the path of repentance, seeing where we've gone wrong, coming back off that path, getting things right, and going on a new path. Today, we are looking at the practices of sexual wholeness, the fourth discipline. Last week, we spoke about the meaning of sexual wholeness. Today, the practices. And here's what the author writes. He looked at a copy of ESPN, the magazine, a few years ago, and it had the title, The Body Issue. And it says, every body, capital body, has a story. And so everybody, every body does indeed have a story of pain, pleasure, frustration, abuse, nurture, regret, shame, and love. And most of us have experienced all of these things. And so, given that, how is it that we can honor our own bodies and honor the bodies of others? How do we change our old scripts that we've played out that have formed us or deformed us? How can we seek healing and integrity and love? In other words, how do we love God with our bodies? And so here are some practices that we can pursue. Now, let's remember sexuality and spirituality are very much similar. They both have the trajectory, the end goal, the satisfaction in each of them come from going beyond ourselves. They are not in meeting my needs, they are in ultimately uh, going beyond ourselves to be known by another, to know another, and to ultimately be connected in that way with God and another person, and be connected with that other person deeply with God in the middle of it. And so, the first place to start is probably in naming our history of being trained in sexual things. What was the messaging that you got from your parents and society around you as you were growing up? For me, I grew up in a household where we just didn't talk about sex. We didn't talk about anything. We just really didn't talk. There was my father, then 2 sons, and my mother. I feel so badly for my mom. We weren't talkers. And that must have been so painful for her. But therefore, sex, never came up. And, and really, secrecy on that topic was was our was the name of the game in our household. In fact, the way that I learned the facts of life was I had a horse. It was a mare. Her name was Blaze. And my dad put me on the horse, and I rode to another stable to have Blaze bred. And he drove his car over there, and we watched as Blaze was bred with a stud, a stallion. And when we came home, my dad simply said, "What you saw there is how it is also works in humans." Well, what I saw there was a physical act. And I just figured, well, that's it. This goes here, that goes there. That's how it works. If you've got desires, fulfill them. And then babies come out. You got to be careful about that. And that was my training. I don't blame my father because I'm sure he had worse training from his father. But but the idea is that I would go off, and as puberty grew and hormones took over, there were desires and they needed to be met, and they needed to be met with somebody of the opposite sex, and that's what sex and relationships was about. And then sort of take that, and it falls into a cycle for a lot of people. You begin to date in high school and then in college and afterwards as an adult, and then you see somebody and you are attracted, and you just assume that attraction has to lead to genital sex, and maybe it does or doesn't, but it leads to some sort of physical intimacy, and then you're together for a while and you find out, well, all right, that doesn't work so well, and maybe you break up and you try it again. And then you do it again and again. And sooner or later, you begin to think, is this working for me? That we could call sobriety, when you're beginning to ask that question: is the cycle that I'm into really working for me? The author of this book uh, makes an interesting comparison to Harry Potter. In that book series, Voldemort was the evil figure, and so everybody would not nobody would name his name. They would all say, him who cannot be named. But Harry called him Voldemort. He was able to name him, uh, identify him for what he was, and after naming him, Harry was the one who was able to overcome him. We need to be able to do the same thing with our practices of expressing our sexuality. Is our way of approaching it working for us? You could take that from dating to pornography to whatever. And do you have the ability to get out of that and into something that is healthy? A really good statement I heard once is, get on the good side of how things work and realize that typically you can't do it on your own. Um, Dallas Willard, the great theologian, philosopher, um, said that lead us not into temptation. That in the Lord's Prayer is is our prayer of no confidence in ourselves. We need God, we need help. And then from there, we recognize, okay, I can't go on the starvation diet. It doesn't work. And I can't go on stay on the McDonald's diet, meeting my own needs, um, having this opposite sex partner for a while, and then breaking up and doing it all over again. That doesn't work either. What's fascinating is, to me, people who study these things say that since the sexual revolution, and then, up until the last uh, 10, 15 years, people were having a lot more sex. But at the very same time, people were becoming lonelier than ever. And these same people who study these things are beginning to now say young people, teenagers and young adults, they're having less sex. And they're saying it because they are beginning to recognize this isn't doing it for me. They're getting, of course, getting hooked on their cell phones is a is a big thing these days also. But I think about that song by Johnny Cash. The line goes like this: on a Sunday morning sidewalk, I'm wishing, Lord, that I was stoned. Because there's something in a Sunday that makes a body feel alone. And Johnny Cash was in touch with spiritual things. And I feel like in those lines, he was saying, oh, there's something more out there. Sunday morning, there's a God, but I am so alone, living the lifestyle that I am now. And so um, I remember also finding out, and I've talked about this before, when I found the singles ministry back in the 80s and early 90s, 70s and 80s, there were singles ministries, and I found myself into my way into one, and I became a Christian there, and I found myself so relieved. I found three girls, three women, two other guys, and we formed a tennis group every Thursday night for several years. And there were attractions, physical attractions to each other, but we didn't have to act on them. We could enjoy each other. We had dinner together. We played tennis. And and I remember feeling so relieved that I didn't have to get back into those old cycles that didn't work. And I learned there that physical touch could be non sexual. It was awesome. And so learning physical touch, non sexual physical touch, was so huge. We learned that 7 hugs a day is necessary for physical health. Um, and so in Salzburg, it was kind of funny. Back in the last several years we spent in Salzburg, Austria, we Northern European type, my ancestry is Northern European. We didn't touch, we didn't hug, but the Southern Europeans, the Africans, they did a whole lot of hugging. And so, walking through the train station one day, Kathy and I, we see Jemima. She comes up and hugs us right in the middle of the train station. Loved that. And so having learned that and learning how to express touch is so important. That's why the laying on of hands in prayer matters so much. That's why when Kathy comes up behind me and just hugs me from behind or touches my neck, and it's special. We need to learn that. We need to practice that. And so this takes us to the final practice I'll mention today of sexual wholeness, and it has to do with lovemaking. Lovemaking. Um, Lovemaking. It's kind of interesting. I saw a video on YouTube. I don't know how it came up, but a man was talking to his wife, presumably. She was standing in the kitchen, and he said to her, he was saying, "Look at this woman, how beautiful she is. She needs to be loved and hugged and romanced and encouraged and complimentary words, and she needs all of these wonderful things, and she deserves them all." And she's standing there smiling. And then he says, what does a guy need? Well, a guy needs for the woman to show up naked and bring food. That's it. Well, lovemaking, in order to do it right, we sort of start with those two kinds of differences. But to do it right takes practice. And the starting point for lovemaking, and this is what the Bible starts with, and Jesus affirms it in so many ways, that when you feel attracted to another person, and there's a trajectory toward becoming one, toward the genital sexual union. In Genesis 2, it says the two become one. And it starts out with a man and a woman, and the woman is taken from Adam's side. And the symbolism there is that she is not taken from his feet, so he rules over her, not taking from his head, so that she rules over him, but from his side, so there's mutuality, equality. The two become one. And they are one in purpose because they are both created to populate the world, civilize it, make it a godly place, one in purpose, and presumably one forever. Jesus said two become one and never let them get apart. So that means one emotionally, one physically, one spiritually, one in purpose. one economically. We share all of our goods and life together in every way, shape, and form. We are one. And without that full oneness of commitment, when we take the genital connection, when we take that oneness out of that, that's when it goes south. That's when it doesn't fulfill. But when it has this protective casing around it, then it becomes an awesome and beautiful thing. And so often we take these old patterns of the cycle I mentioned, we bring them into marriage, and that messes up the marriage. We need to practice the complete oneness. For instance, a guy, he needs to learn that lovemaking doesn't start when you take your clothes off at night. Lovemaking starts in the kitchen in the morning. Actually, before that, lovemaking starts when you put your clothes on in the morning and learning to love her in all the ways that she needs to be loved. Conversely, a woman needs to understand a man and respect him. And this takes practice. One man said, uh, my wife and I have been married 50 years, and we are having the best sex we've ever had in our lives because it takes practice. And I'll close with this. Tim Keller wrote a great book. It's called The Reason for Marriage. I hope you read it. It covers all of this and so much more. He says lovemaking um, is a covenant renewal ceremony. When you made your covenant in marriage and you've committed to each other for life, and then you consummated it in the bedroom, and you finally became one in all the different ways, including physically, that was a covenant made between you and your spouse and before God, and it's a picture of the oneness of God, you and and your spouse. That's a picture of the Trinity. That's a picture of God. And every time that you make love with your spouse, that's renewing the covenant. That's renewing the wedding ceremony. And when you have a marriage that is like that, with all of those things involved, openness, communication, vulnerability, love of each other, full respect, it overflows. A marriage like that cannot help but overflow into the world around that marriage, into the people around you. And you are actually witnessing, whether you know it or not, you are modeling a picture of the final consummation of all things. The consummation of all things is a wedding ceremony. Heaven and earth will be merged. And that little picture of that is you and your spouse um, in marriage, where people see each of you going beyond yourselves toward each other and toward God in a special kind of oneness that isn't expressed in any other way um, on planet Earth. Well, a lot there, isn't it? I hope you take it all to heart and that you find your way to sexual wholeness in your lives. God bless you. Have a great day. Bye bye.